Today's topic is making cover crops work in areas with less than 20 inches of rainfall. And it's something I've been wanting to do for a while, and maybe you could say I've been hesitating a little bit because those of you know that I live in southeastern Pennsylvania, and full disclaimer, we actually get double that. We actually get 40 inches of rainfall, so that's my personal experience. That may seem like I'm unqualified to have this talk. I get that. That being said, I've been to dry land areas around the world, and I have been observing what goes on there. And the nice thing about it is there certainly are principles in cover cropping that do apply literally worldwide, no matter what your precept is, anywhere from 10 inches annual to over 100 inches annual. I've seen cover crops working in all those scenarios. And I like to remind my dryland friends that just because I get 40 inches of rain a year doesn't mean that's all just glory, because being too wet sometimes can be just as detrimental as being too dry. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there right up front here that that's where I'm coming from, and I'm looking forward to some folks I see on here that could maybe chime in later on at the end and comment and so forth on this topic, because I'm sure there'll be some good ideas that can be shared. So you asked the question, well, how can you grow cover crops in a low rainfall area? They take up moisture, right? Well, yeah, they do take up moisture, but what's our option? Is this our only option? You see this picture here of basically fallow-tilled soil. And this happened to be in Australia. I'm going to draw heavily on Australia today because that's where most of my experience has been in dryland areas. And I've been up to Derek's region and other people, Saskatchewan, Alberta, western U.S., over in Eastern Europe. I've been in areas that have had that average less than 20 inches of rainfall. So, you look at this picture here and knowing the group that I'm talking to, you're like, well, that, it's definitely not what we want to see. So how do we grow cover crops? And what is the point of growing cover crops in a low rainfall environment? And it's against the backdrop of the question, can I use available moisture to be able to grow a plant that may not help my cash crop? Well, let's look at first of all, I just mentioned before I even go down this list here, what does nature do? When you leave nature go, even in dry areas, there tends to be some plants growing. So we know that it is indeed possible. So some of the key concepts here for low rainfall areas, and I'll just say a lot of these you've seen before for other areas, but there's some of the ones that I came up with here. And maybe I'm not saying this is the most important, but it's certainly one of the most important. They're feeding the biology of the soil. I think we're finding out now that is huge in the long-term investment in our soils, is to feed that biology, and you have to use plants to do that. Yes, you can bring in compost and you can bring in different amendments and stuff, but that works in certain situations, but that's cost prohibitive, and it's just not available in a lot of areas. So having the option, it brings us back to the only option then of growing plants, because we know that works. And if we can, of course, manage for the diversity of the species, and I'm going to say not just in cover crops, but also in cash crops as well. A soil doesn't know if a plant is a cash crop or a cover crop. So if we can have diverse species, that is definitely going to build a foundation of success. And I'll just point out again, the Derek Axton is on here from Saskatchewan. is using companion cropping or multi-species cash crops growing together. And that's a kind of a new area of growing, of farming. And he's in a dry area. And I'm trying to mimic some of those things even on my farm where I can. So the diversity of species is very, very important to make this work. And then here's what flies in the face of conventional wisdom, having something growing year round, because agriculture has evolved in the dryland areas to save the moisture for the cash crop. And there's, just from a theoretical viewpoint, that may seem like the way to go. But now looking at what we know now and the effectiveness of biology, and I would say building case studies, if you will, of farmers who are successful in using cover crops in low fall areas are indeed trying to grow something year round. And so what are the benefits we get out of this? Well, some of it is keeping the soil cooler. Just because we have a plant growing there, it literally blocks the sun and keeps the soil cooler through shading. Now I'm going to talk about temperatures later on and how that affects soil life, but I'll just leave that for now. And then, of course, the big one here is water management. I'm just going to go through these, and we're going to discuss them a little bit more broadly later. But water infiltration, being able to capture the rain as it falls from the sky, being able to hold the water that falls, limiting erosion from wind or from water, and then also limiting evapotranspiration. So these are some of the things that are really, really important. And it does vary. That last one there varies depending on what part of the latitude you are. And as we were discussing before we came on here, it makes a difference if you're in northern latitudes versus southern latitudes. The intensity of the sun and all that does indeed have a role in how this all works out. So I think, first of all, at the outset here, I want to just make a comment, and I just put this slide in here about adjusting expectations in dry areas. I would have to say that there's more management that comes into play when you're working in a dryland environment. You could say it's a little less forgiving. I'm not sure if it's more risky. I didn't want to put that up there. It's only more risky if you don't know what you're doing. So I just kind of want to mention that. So, when you're in dry land, less than 20 inches of rainfall, to be able to make this work, it's not going to be a cookie cutter approach. And this applies to any cover cropping, but more so with working in dryland areas. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But I just think to be fair to the topic, adjusting expectations, I think, is important, because the dryland areas essentially mostly have not been the leaders of the cover crop movement. However, that being said, in those areas, there's beginning to now emerge a group of, I'm going to call, very top level manager type farmers that are indeed making it work. So again, just a little perspective here on my approach to all this and my approach to the topic today. So I've been to Australia a couple times. This is Josh Walters in southeastern Australia. He said a statement that I've used frequently. Those of you who have heard me speak live have probably seen this slide. His comment is, in Australia, we need to build a bigger bucket. And that is directly applied to the soil's ability to capture and retain water. And so he says every drop of water that falls out of the sky, we want to capture it and we want to hold it as long as possible. And the way we do that is with no soil disturbance, cover crops, diversity, and living roots. So I just listed 4 basic things there. We apply that to almost every single aspect of cover cropping, but here again, it applies to low rainfall areas. And I think there's a couple other things here too. I just want to lay the case out for how this works, but it's a long-term commitment. And again, it applies to cover cropping in general, but maybe more so in the context of dry land, because there are some years where frankly it's just too dry to even get a cover crop to germinate. And I can talk all day here, but if it's too dry to get it to germinate, it ain't happening. So I get that. I understand that. But it's about being an opportunist, and I'm going to share a few of those things coming up. So the whole long-term commitment really, really does apply to this conversation. And when I say long-term, I'm saying minimal 10 years. If you're going into cover cropping and you're in a dry land environment, you want to have essentially a 10-year plan. And I'm not saying that you have every year figured out. What I'm saying is you are looking at this as a long-term commitment to make this work. So that's just an overview of going into the discussion. Some more specifics now. I mentioned soil temperatures. I want to thank the Burleigh County Conservation District from North Dakota for some of these pictures. That area, I think I was really, I guess you would say, learned about more of the dry land cover cropping when I spoke for their meeting in 2007, I think it was, in North Dakota. And that was, for me, it was really informative to see some of the work they were doing there in this low rainfall environment. So there's just a picture there of in the summer, and I'm assuming that's probably an inch or two into the soil. Right there's a 20-degree difference in the soil temperature. And I mean, you might say that's not that high there, but when you look at a scientific viewpoint, management of it, again, I'm going to credit the Burleigh County Conservation District for this information. At 140 degrees, the soil bacteria, they die. And as the temperature is lower, there is an increasingly available moisture is used for growth. And that just is common sense, but this is the data. We kind of know this, but if you can keep your soil 10, 20, 30 degrees cooler, you're going to do a lot for keeping your soil life alive. And that's why we can see some benefits that sometimes I could argue take the place of the moisture that we use up as a cover crop. And just the fact that a cover crop uses up moisture, it gives that back because the next rain that falls, every drop is going to infiltrate into it. So the whole moisture, I guess you'd say concern, is a real concern, but it comes back to management. I thought about calling it the moisture myth, but I thought that may be a little too strong because you got to be a really good manager here, and you got to pay attention to the weather cycles that you may have that are historically natural in your area. But if you can keep that temperature lower, and I think this is one of the keys that cover crops do, because that picture I showed you of the bare soil, I mean, I've seen readings of soil in the top 1 inch that's well over 140 degrees on a very, very hot day. And it's basically cooking everything to death. So you could just use an analogy that the soil life in the soil is not much different than you and I as human beings. Once it gets over 100 degrees, things go downhill pretty quick. And so that's again, just a good analogy I feel that we can use here when we think about what we're doing to our soil when our soil is not covered. And I just honestly, I know enough farmers who are doing this that I can't think of a good reason to do fallow situation in any given crop rotation. So now I teased you a little bit in some of my promos for this here about the driest area in the world that are successfully growing cover crops. The farmer here, who happens to be the fourth one in from the right, with the blue shirt, looks like he might be holding a water container or something. This is on his farm near Adelaide, Australia. And he said, I just have to go on what he said, that they're looking at about an average of a 10-inch rainfall annual is their average, 10 inches in a year. And he made the comment that he thinks he might be the driest farmer in the world growing cover crops. And this is with no irrigation. So I'll let him stand behind that, but it is definitely a very, very, very dry area. Now, there's some things to note here on this picture. This is wheat that was harvested about a month before, and obviously uses stripper head. That's a key here. Again, that's to keep the soil covered, and it's also to inherently then also allows the rainwater to infiltrate better. So that was a key component here of his method to all this. Now, if you look close, you can see a little bit of a cover crop coming through. And you'll see this frequently in dry areas. The seeding rates are very low, and that's important. Number one, because it's dry, their overall gross yield, gross profit is certainly not as much. So they can't afford to spend a lot of money on covers, but then again, they don't need to. In a case here where they're using the residue of a cash crop to essentially keep the soil covered, and I would say just enough of plant life there to keep the biology going. And sometimes they'll catch a timely rain, and this will really show up nicely. I'm going to show you a picture of that later on. But in this case here, he's trying to keep the biology active in his soil so that there can be a lot of benefit there. Now, as I always do, I dug a hole, and here happened to be a radish that was part of the mix that was planted here. And you can just see a little bit of the soil profile, and it was, I mean, if you want to use the term bone dry, this would be it. And I was even impressed that radish was even alive. And I couldn't get to the bottom of the root, but there's moisture down there somewhere, or it would be dead. And even though I dug about 18 inches deep. Now, they had moisture sensors that were in this field, and they were doing some research and some actual using cover crops and not using cover crops. They were testing moisture 7 feet or 2 meters deep, and they had just put them in. So I never really followed up and got the data, but they wanted to learn how this moisture factor works on where cover crops are planted and where they're not. I know he had said that preliminary data was that there was very little difference between where there was cover crops and where there wasn't. So this guy was a couple years into this and obviously pursuing it. He was very positive about it, very upbeat about it. He was just one of those farmers who was that typical mindset of, I'm going to make this work. Yep, there's some risk to it, and I have some failures, but I'm going to make it work. And so here again, maybe the driest place on earth growing cover crops. Maybe some of you know some other places that are drier, but that was the story right there. So speaking of techniques that are used, here's stripped wheat. This happens to be in North Dakota. Stripper head wheat on the right, leaving the stubble stand so it catches snow. And in northern areas, this is like, you gotta do this. You just have to, or you'll lose that precious moisture in the winter. On the left-hand side there is pea stubble, which was basically spread out low and doesn't catch any snow. So it's not just putting cover crop seed in the ground and it magically works. There is methods behind this, and it's management. And I'm going to keep coming back to that you have to manage in the context of the geography that you're in to make this successful. The other thing too, again, that I saw in Australia, and I've seen it in many areas that are dry land, is the use of cattle, sheep, or animals in a grazing situation. And just as in any other cover cropping situation, if you have this option, it's going to make cover crops work even better. Here they're doubling, of course, as a forage source, and so this was sheep in Australia out grazing on primarily it was radishes there. So using animals again is maximizing that opportunity. Some of you may have heard of David Cook from Australia. This was when I was on his farm, and he's been doing this for a long time. This is kind of a cool picture here because you can see there was a thunderstorm moving in on the background, and I wanted to show you this because his soil is ready to receive the rain. Now, I don't know exactly what he got, but I would estimate we got 1/4 of an inch out of that. And unfortunately, I did not have pictures after that, but we walked out in his fields, and it just, of course, it all soaked in. It was just, his fields were prepared for that. He had built his bucket, so to speak. And this is one of the leading farmers in Australia that has been using cover crops for quite a few years now. And just to be able to see it working on his farm was just gratifying. You hear about this stuff, but then you go and you actually see for yourself. So just to go back again to my friend Josh Walters, again in Australia. I had this picture earlier. This picture was taken on a dry spell. They were 3 months. I think he only had 3 inches, I believe, in 3 months, or less than 3 inches of rain. Sometimes I have to think through the conversion there, but this particular picture here had been sprayed out with glyphosate about 2 weeks sooner. But you can see not a heavy rate of cover crop, not a lot of growth. It was very dry. Now, I want to take you to another year. This is also Josh, and he's there in the very middle behind the girl there in the middle back there. This was on that same exact farm. I was there twice. This was a year that had rained, and they had caught some timely rains. And here you can see how that's a really, really nice cover crop. They were just happy as can be with that. And his comment, this is part of his comment of building the bigger bucket, but also maximizing the opportunity. And I think that this is, again, a mindset that farmers need to have in anywhere in the world, that's dry land or elsewhere, of maximizing the opportunity. And he's the type of guy, he's going to be planting cover crops pretty much no matter what. And then when you catch that maybe 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 years where you get an outstanding result because the timing of the rains coincided with the planting of the cover crops, you're going to reap many years of benefits out of a cover crop like this. And that was the message that he was sharing that day. So the key is be ready. I'm going to tell you my Montana story right now. Some of you may have heard this, but if you know anything about the culture of Montana, you'll appreciate this. I met a Montana farmer once at a conference, and this was several years ago. It was a really good summer, and they had quite a bit of rain, much more than normal. And he made the comment how these cover crops were just fantastic that year, and how some years they hardly ever grow. But that year, he said, I can really see the difference that cover crops made in my soil. And I told him, I said, well, it was nice you were prepared for that you could be able to do that and take advantage of that opportunity. And in true Montana form, he said, yeah, you gotta have your pistol cocked. And I thought that was a good analogy, basically meaning you gotta be ready. And when the opportunity arises, you have to have the seeds in the ground or be ready to put the seeds in the ground if you happen to catch an unexpected 1 inch rain or something. like that. And that's what I mean by that. You got to be ready to maximize that opportunity when it happens, because it's not going to happen probably every year. So just in reflecting here, that's wasted when you just don't plant anything. There's so much, just is the opportunity that is lost in that. Now, also here, I wanted to show this because this was actually, you'll notice that field that's a little bit greener, more or less in the foreground. And you notice the fence goes up on the right and then comes across the picture. That is management. That happens to be a farmer who's been using cover crops for a while. He was actually renovated his pasture by planting mixed species of, you could call them cover crops, and doubling up as forage. Again, this was a situation where he had sheep, and he said, that's my neighbor's field on the far right and on the top. And he said, you can just see the difference. And we actually walked over, and the difference was actually more apparent when you looked at it close. But that, of course, the same amount of rainfall. And I don't know what his management of his sheep were, but that was just a picture there of management. And basically his point was keeping mixed species growing there, keeping the diversity even in his pasture ground there. So that was just an opportunity to see that. Now, most all my talk today is geared to where the non-irrigated areas. I wanted to show you this picture here. Again, Australia, limited irrigation. They had availability of some water, and their idea was dedicate the water that they had to getting the cover crop growing, basically just to get it germinated. And this is some of the plots that were in there. So again, where water is limited, or where you just don't have a lot of opportunity, how do you manage that? And of course, if it never gets started to grow, it'll never grow. So their feeling was, in years where they don't catch a timely rain, it paid them to irrigate to get their cover crop coming up. So just looking at different species of cover crops, which ones are better. This is again as a cover crop plot, and I don't have the data on this in here of where what the rainfall was, but obviously it is fairly dry. You can see some species are doing better than others. Then here is one of the driest ones I saw. This literally was only 1 inch of rain in 3 months. Very little growth this year in this situation here. So you can if you look through the plot more on the left, the upper left-hand side, you'll see some that hardly grew at all. And I did not get the list of these species, but I do remember, and this is coming from my travels and so forth, what some of the better ones are. And there's nothing new on here. There's no magical drought-tolerant cover crop that I'm aware of. But sorghum Sudan looks strong. Sun hemp is decent. Some of the millets, there's a lot of different types of millets out there. Sunflowers seem to do well. All these have somewhat of an aggressive rooting, which makes sense. So this is some of the ones you could plant in the summer. You could throw radishes in there in the summer if you wanted. In the fall, radishes always look fairly good in these situations. Again, it's because of the taproot that can go down and find moisture. Cereal rye is good. Some varieties of triticale. Annual ryegrass, I was hesitating if I should put this up here or not. One reason is because a lot of dryland areas just don't like annual ryegrass, because they typically be growing wheat there, and it could become a weed. So that's why I left it off, but you may ask the question, annual ryegrass is a deep rooter. So in a dairy situation, no problem there. Cash grain, small grains, you might want to be careful of putting annual ryegrass in this type of a region. So what about cover crop seeding rates? I mentioned that. This here farmer was very, very happy with this rate of radish. It was he wasn't sure, between 1 and 2 pounds an acre. That's about what it looked like. But that and again, someone has been growing cover crops for a while. So it's just, in this case, his goal wasn't to have 100% foliage covered. You can see that there is still some residue left there, but the seeding rates can be dropped back significantly in the drier land areas. But it does come back to what you're trying to do. If it's forage, then you probably want to increase your seeding rates to accommodate that situation. If you have enough of residue there from a previous crop or residue, you don't have to have 100% coverage, because not only is it a seed saving cost, the biological effect, those roots go out, they go down, but they go out and they're in the soil profile. So they're doing some good. And I'm just giving a general statement here that in this case, lower seeding rates are pretty much a standard for low rainfall areas. I've heard someone say already, and I think this is just a guideline, but the amount you spend on a cover crop per acre can be correlated close to what your annual rainfall is. And it works in American dollars. So 20-inch rainfall, $20 an acre is max. 30-inch rainfall, $30 an acre. So take that for whatever it's worth. It's just a really loose guideline. But anyway, thought I'd mention that. Again, talking about species, one of the things that was interesting is I saw this in several different fields. They're very, very dry. I literally used a screwdriver to dig this radish root out. I could not use a shovel. It was too dry. It was too hard. Again, this is about 18 inches deep, not a lick of moisture there that I could tell. What was interesting is if you look on the picture on the right, that's canola or oilseed rape on the right, and the radishes on the left, 2 radishes and 1 canola. There was we couldn't find any canola plants that were really getting down. Now, they were still alive, as you can see on that picture, but they weren't going down. What they were excited about, and this was new for me, is they have high potassium in their subsoil. So they were excited about these radishes pulling up potassium that their cash crops never reach. They seemed to say they had some data on it. But again, that was just, in that soil type, in that area, these radishes were getting down there, finding potassium and bringing it to the top. So again, that's just, what are you trying to accomplish? What can your cover crops do? What can't they do? What's the limitations? All these factors are going to enter in from area to area, but it just, again, the importance of knowing what you're trying to accomplish is really important. So that's the bulk of my presentation. Here's kind of the outline. I'm going to open it up here. I would like to have some comments or some questions. I guess I just got everyone open up now. So if you have any question or comment, I would really, really appreciate it. If I don't know the answer, maybe some other ones will here. So what's your questions for us this morning?
Steve, this is David.
Yes.
Ma'am, I'm just curious, what percent organic matter, those slides you showing from down under there, are they achieving with those cover crops? And they're kind of comparable to, well, I noticed, you got some wooded areas in the background. I mean, that's kind of what we always talk about. You can't get 8%, but you ought to be able to get something close to what's in those undisturbed natural areas.
As far as I know, most of those areas were in the 1% to 2% range in the fields. Yeah, and I will say it's difficult to build organic matter quick because of you're just not getting a lot of rooting and biomass action going on there. But they're slowly helping that a little bit. So yeah, 1% to 2% is pretty much what I was familiar with.
Okay. One other comment about your temperatures, people forget that if you look at the national or standards for composting.
Oh yeah.
It's 131 degrees, I think, is what I mean, you have to maintain it for consecutive days, that kind of thing. But if folks do not think that temperatures affect microbial action in the soil, just compare it to that. We compost, and actually when you're windrow it, you actually compost it at 115 degrees.
Well,
again,
okay. Yeah. Oh, that's a kind of an interesting observation there. So, I would just say too, if any of you can to type in the chat box. I saw one person did already, but if there's anything you want to ask there, if you're don't have a microphone, I'll watch that. But I see Derek's on. Derek's from Saskatchewan, 14 to 16 inches. Do you have comments, questions? What did I miss?
Oh, I thought you did really well. That's
okay.
Pretty much what we've been seeing, and I think your comment on context was really great. I mean, that's exactly what I tell guys. I mean, it's all about context, understanding where you live and how much rain you get, because, I mean, where we are, we want more rain, and obviously we want to grow a bunch of biomass, but, I mean, the reality is it usually doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So, the low seeding rates is exactly what we've been doing. And we've been trying to seed as close to behind the combines as we can. Mm-hmm. This year we're going to do some attempting to get it seeded before harvest. I think that's the biggest thing for us is getting it established, because the seed costs the same and the equipment pass costs the same. So for us to try to establish it sooner so we can have a better chance of getting a rain to start it.
So, Derek, how do you approach when the ground is too dry for germination? Do you plant anyway, or do you wait for rain?
We did this year. We seeded a couple of thousand acres behind the combines, and it's the first time I've seen it sit in dry dirt for just about 6 weeks, almost 2 months, some of it.
Wow.
And in the end of September, we got some rain, and it grew. And
okay.
I was starting to wonder if it was going to grow in the spring, but it did come finally.
Okay. So I guess I'll just mention the worst thing that could happen is you get a very light shower of rain that germinates the cover crop, and then it's just not enough moisture to keep it living. So that's the risk you take in doing that, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And we did have that happen. The very first field we seeded back in, it would have been almost the end of July. Mm-hmm. That happened to us, and we lost probably 50 or 70% of it. It germed and died. Absolutely, yeah.
And I just think that is something that you need to tell farmers. It's the risk they assume, because we assume that same exact risk in our cash crops. And when it fails, we understand it. Sometimes cover crops get a bad rap. But it's a risk. It just is. And I think it's important to share that. Well, any other comments, Derek, while you're on, because you live this every day. Do you want to just briefly mention your companion cropping, your cash crops, to whatever degree you want to, just what you're trying to do there?
Well, no, I guess a quick note, like on the covers that work well in dry land that we've noticed, that your list was really pretty much bang on. The other one we noticed that we really liked was safflower.
Oh.
We thought it did really well in the dry land. Last year in our plots, it was probably the one that seemed to care the least about the drought. It looked pretty good.
Okay. I will take note of that. Good.
Yeah, we were quite happy with it. So, and it produced really well, considering, compared to all the other species we had out. So,
yeah.
And as far as the intercropping, I mean, yeah, all of our broadleaf, we started in 11. Andy Kirschman's on too, and maybe he can chime in, but we started in 11. I think Andy was maybe even ahead of me a couple of years on that.
Uh-huh.
And, we started with fairly basic, but we started adding legumes to our non-legume broadleaf crops. Like we started with canola and we graduated to mustards.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's how we've been doing all of our broadleaf acres now for the last 3 years.
Uh-huh.
But this year we're going to add legumes to everything. We're going to there won't be a monocrop on the farm. Okay,
so that's great. I knew you were headed that way, and for some people that's like you're out of your mind territory, but there's certainly growing momentum for that kind of stuff. But you got to know what you're doing to do that. Yeah, Andy, do you want to chime in here? Andy's from Alberta. If you could get your microphone on there, Andy, and just any comments, thoughts, suggestions?
Well, maybe I was ahead of Derek, but I definitely didn't implement on the number of acres. I started with 20 acres one year and had to swap it. It was canola on an intercrop, but I think the seeding rate is something we still have to work with. We see all those pictures of 6, 7, 8,000 pound an acre biomass rolling rye down, and boy, do we think that looks good. But that takes years of our moisture to grow that, so it probably isn't the goal that we should have.
Right.
But
right.
Regarding covers, we're in a pretty. I think we're probably a shorter season than Derek. He's a little further south and a little warmer. My goal is to start figuring out what we can companion crop, low-growing legumes and other forbs that we can grow with our cash crops, and then the herbicide is something to figure out. But hopefully we can back off on that as we introduce the diversity anyway.
Good. Now, see, I see there's a Justin on here. I'm not sure if this is the Justin from Alberta or not. Just if you can hear me, Justin, I wouldn't mind you. Is this the Justin from Alberta? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Justin Dubin from Alberta.
Okay, good. I didn't see your last name here, so good. Any comments from you about this topic?
Yeah, most of our land is irrigated, but I'd say there's a lot more risk where the dry land patches are that have cover crops. See, part of the reason I compare to Australia with us is what Andy was saying, is the season is so short. So if you don't get a little bit of moisture when you seeded that, like, you only got a little bit of time to grow that cover crop, and after that point it's too cold. So I think I'm kind of on board with Andy's idea of trying to get either perennials growing there or establishing something with your cash crop, I guess, what Derek's doing too.
So you have some irrigation. Can you justify the cost of irrigation to help a cover crop grow?
Yeah.
Okay.
When I grow a cover crop under irrigation, I irrigate it the same as I would my cash crops.
Okay.
So
awesome.
I think it's just as much water, but like in terms of moisture, we would average, I think, about 12 inches a year.
Okay.
And even with irrigation, like last year, we had about 6 inches of moisture. We're still under that 20-inch limit. So 20 inches is like a lot of moisture to work with for us when you know the possibility of having much less than that there is a reality. So. Yeah.
Well, I'd like Monty to chime in here. And while you're getting on, Monty, if you're still with us, a few things in the chat box here. One question of any results of potassium increase in radish cover crops. I mentioned that, and that is indeed, I've seen that in quite a few areas around, I'll say, U.S. and I'm not sure about Canada, but yeah, we've seen some potassium increases, especially when you analyze the foliage of a radish. It will always show very high in potassium. And as far as noticing soil test levels go up, I don't have data on that. I know that's probably the bottom line, maybe the question you're asked, but I do know that it certainly helps in bringing that up there. So anyway, Monty, are you still on? I wouldn't mind hearing your comment about everything here, because Monty spends a lot of time in the drier areas. So what's your comments, Monty?
So one of the biggest things we always wonder about is what are we spending water-wise on a cover crop, and what are we saving water-wise because of the cover crop? Either saving from not needing a tillage pass because we've got Roundup Ready kochia, or saving from having cover on the ground and less soil temperature. And working with Jeff Mitchell for about 5 years on this right now, and he has shown in Central Valley, California, where we have pretty high ET rates, that if you spend about 2.1, 2.3 inches of water on a cover crop, you actually gain about 2.6 to 2.8 inches of water availability later in the season.
So there's a net gain?
Yeah, he's documented net gain neutron probes, and so working with one of his grad students right now, she should have that published in a peer-reviewed journal. Will be submitted in June. So it's pretty exciting, because at the end of the day, that's the question we need to answer, because in dry land farming or irrigated farming, as a farmer myself and the customers we work with, they wonder, okay, how much water am I wasting? They think wasting on a cover crop.
Right.
I can't afford to waste water on it.
Yeah.
Well, if we can show them that water balance, now we've eliminated a big question in their mind.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. Other questions from anyone?
Hey, Steve, it's Wayne.
Yes, Wayne.
Just a question on the safflower there. How late can that be planted in the fall?
That's a question for Derek, if you're still on, Derek. How late can you plant safflower? Are you talking about Montana now, Wayne?
Yeah, that's correct.
How'd you like my analogy there?
Yeah, that was pretty good. That's typical.
Yeah, Derek, I don't know if you're still on. What's the planting window for safflower?
The stuff I did was in June that we got good growth on. I didn't add to my late season mixes. It was just in our full season covers that we grazed.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I didn't. Okay. But I'm going to try some this fall after seeing how well it did. I was wishing, but when it was so dry when we were seeding those covers, they were pretty basic. Mm-hmm. We didn't get too exotic when it was so dry this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. I'm thinking it would probably, if you have the moisture, it would probably work like right after wheat, and that's kind of what my question was for.
Good. Kabar from California, NRCS, has a question here in the chat. What I understand, or as a comment actually, and I want to follow up. What I understand, the radish is mining for potassium, or for phosphorus, since it doesn't have any mycorrhizal association, and I think that is a correct statement. And just again, we're talking about getting nutrients up and so forth. Indeed, because radish is a brassica, it does not host mycorrhizae, but it does search out and collect phosphorus as well. So that's a good comment there. So are there any questions about anything in cover cropping? I'm going to just post the next topic that we're going to do here next week, but any other questions at all? Let's just open it up to anything else, any other questions you might have. You can stay on this topic as well, but just want to...
Yeah, I've got a question for you guys.
Yes, Eric.
This is Eric in South Dakota. So, yeah, we typically end up trying to ask ourselves the same question from year to year. Is it too dry to seed a cover crop? And so has anybody messed around with trying to seed deeper and then either adjust your closing wheels to not close the seed trench, or maybe just lightly close it, you know what I mean? Seed deeper to try to seed into moisture, but then not bury the seed so deep?
Does anyone have experience on seeding deeper just to get moisture, but then not closing the seed trench so the seed has a chance to get up?
I just have a comment about that. I think that's a great idea for funneling what moisture you do get into the seed trench. And it's also a good idea for helping break wind at the soil surface. So for those two reasons, it's really good. I mean, in Mexico, they use some of that planting technique where they'll plant it in a valley in order to draw water to it. So I have not seen it done, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, and I'll chime in here too. I have seen, again, going back to Australia, where they're planting wheat literally 6 inches below the soil surface, but the design of it was the wheat seed was only covered by about 2 inches, so there's like a 4-inch divot, if you want to call it that. Now that takes a lot of horsepower. It's essentially like strip tilling, but that's the way they get it up and going. And I'm not saying that would be very aggressive tillage to do that, but it certainly is a technique. Now, personally, once we were very dry here on my farm, and yes, we do get dry. I want to remind everybody, we always have a dry spell sometime during the year, but we were very dry, and moisture was down, was at 2 inches, and I planted radishes 2 inches deep, which is a lot deeper than you would normally suggest to do that. And they actually came up fine. I did nothing to adjust the closing wheels as to not close the slot. They come up fine. 2 reasons. One is because we didn't have rain. That would have closed the slot even further. And my soils, I'm going to have to say, are healthy enough that they wouldn't have crusted over anyway. So on a healthy soil, I have found planting deeper is a tactic that you can do, especially in the summer. It's amazing how deep small seeds will come up. I think your question though, Eric, is merited because you can actually adjust some of the closing wheels, even on a John Deere drill. You can adjust them further away or you just use spacers, and so it doesn't close the slot completely. And so I don't know if anyone has experience with that, but boy, that's certainly something I would try. If moisture's 2 or 3 inches deep, I'd get it down there to get it going and get it growing. Any other comments on that tactic?
Steve, this is Aaron from Nebraska.
Yep.
Paul Yaza here with UNL has quite a bit of guidance on planting around 3 inches deep, and he's found that by planting a cocktail of species, he's getting the larger seeded ones to kind of break it open, and then the smaller seeded stuff then will germinate after that or emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And so he finds the cocktail is really important for emergence. One other comment on drought tolerant species in southwest Nebraska, they found that woolly pod vetch actually germinates better with lower soil moistures.
Oh.
Kind of just an anecdotal thing, but we're trying to utilize that a little more often in drier situations.
Well, Aaron,
and
do you know where
we've had good success with softflower too? So
okay, that's good to hear. But do you know where woolly pod vetch comes from?
Go ahead.
It comes from Australia. Maybe that's a hint on why it does better on drier situations. It's probably genetically, inclined to that. So that might be a little tip for some of you guys in dryland areas to know. And we got a couple questions coming in here. Monty, if you're still on, Derek is asking if there's any data from Jeff Mitchell that's public there on that moisture usage. If you could get back to us on that would be kind of cool. If it's available, that would be interesting data. So is that something you could have access to?
I have the preliminary data, but I don't have the published data from all 5 years. So that we should have that wrapped up in, like I said, in June.
Okay. So Derek, if you don't hear anything from Monty in the end of June, feel free to bug him or whatever. So another question from Eon from the UK: would buckwheat be a good species for a dryland scenario because it germinates with low moisture and covers the ground fairly quickly to achieve shading? Anyone experience buckwheat in dryland? Well, I'll just say that Derek responded to that saying that he pretty much adds buckwheat to all their mixtures until September. So, and he says he really likes it. So I think, Eon, that's a good one there for you to try. It sounds like it's definitely one to try.
Steve?
Yeah.
One question for you is Derek commented about wanting that information. Do the other innovators on this phone call agree that that's a vital piece of information, is knowing what that water balance exchange is versus just, I think it would work in order to convert more people in dryland areas to utilizing cover crops?
Oh, I think it'd be a game changer.
I'd be curious on anybody else who wants to comment. They think that's a good thing, but.
What do others think?
I think that's Lauren, the number one.
Go ahead, Lauren.
I put the link up on the website for that German data that I shared last week on Twitter.
Okay.
That essentially is the same thing.
Awesome.
And then I know Neil locally is going to be doing some of that.
Good. I think that's important because people who are on the fence need to see that. Plus, I think we need to also learn maybe how to manage things a little better when we see some of this data at different soil depths, and so forth. Others have any more comments on that?
I think it's absolutely critical. This is Aaron from Nebraska again. And UNL are here in Nebraska is also doing similar type research, and they have some on-farm trials this year and are going to continue on with them. So
Good.
Is Dr. Ermach doing that work or somebody else?
A counterpart, Jenny Reese, she's collaborating with him though.
Okay. He has the most advanced sensing equipment in the world. So it's, I ought to, I haven't talked to him for 4 or 5 years. I ought to reconnect. Thank you.
I'm probably speaking for Derek and others this year. They want that sensors. They want their sensors, Marty, so. Anyway, another question here from Kabar from NRCS in California. Lentils is a leguminous cover crop, goes nicely in low moisture conditions. They said they noticed that in the drought in California at their plant materials center out there. So that's good to know as well. And I do know that lentils seem to be prominent more in dryland areas. Does anyone else have any comments on lentils? My list is growing here. Okay, any other question? Our time's about up. If there's any other question, get it ready. I'm going to just mention, I'm going to kind of take almost an opposite topic next week. Tips for successfully using cover crops in heavy clay soils, which these are the soils that tend to be wetter. So I don't know, I kind of am intentional here. I'm going to swing the pendulum, and I'll just give you a hint. This will not surprise you. There will be some repetitive things because, as we all know, cover crop principles work the same, but it's important to understand the application, though, of how that works because the way their management is altogether different. So that's going to be my topic next week coming up here. Any other questions? We've got a minute or two here or so. Any other questions on any cover crop question?
Yeah, I got a question about I know kochia weed gets a bad rap because it's now resistant to Roundup and 4-D in a lot of spots.
Yeah.
Has anybody been messing with it for cover crop? Because it's super water efficient and it can grow a lot of biomass.
Okay, I'm sure for some people that would be like asking if Johnson grass could be a good cover crop. But I'll leave that up to the others. We don't have kochia in my area. Who deals with kochia? Could it be the next great cover crop or what? Any comments?
I guess there are a lot of advanced farmers out in western Kansas after all.
So
I didn't know they were all using cover crops and instead of letting their fallow grow wild. So I completely had the wrong opinion this entire time.
I sense a tongue in cheek there, but that's good. Go ahead, Eric.
The only time we'll let kochia grow as a cover crop is in our saline spots where we can't get anything else to grow.
Okay.
But I wouldn't necessarily call it a cover crop, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, that's where I was just trying to use it as, because nothing else grows in a lot of our high saline spots. And then if you can get enough kochia to grow, you can plant like tall wheatgrass into the kochia stubble. And then I found that you can get tall wheatgrass to establish after that. But it is kind of a worst case scenario, but it's like better than nothing, I guess.
Well, in all seriousness, I know you were asking a serious question there, Derek. Derek's from Oregon, by the way, Eastern Oregon, dryland. Anyway, I think the biggest concern is how do you control it? How do you terminate it? And if that could be figured out, I'm just kind of surmising here. Someone else can correct me if I'm wrong. If we could figure out how to terminate kochia, maybe there would be some merit to managing it. I'll just put it that way. Any thoughts on that? Anyone?
I guess our saline areas are typically small enough where we can get in there and clip it, versus trying to spray it or terminate it other ways, keep it from going to seed however we can.
Okay, any other comments? Kind of last call here.
This is Andy here. I would think kochia got a pretty strong main stem. It might be able to be crimped actually because of the growth habit of it.
There you go, Andy. A new project for 2018. roll cripping kochia. Let us know how it works out. And then you start collecting the seeds if it works out, and you might have a business. Anyway.
Yeah, I think brown fallow would be a real good cover crop for other people as well. So I have really good ideas. This is not close to me.
Okay, gotcha. Hey, I just want to thank you all. Great question, great discussion today. Appreciate your support. We'll look forward to seeing you on Facebook discussion group or next week. And have a great week as you're getting ready for planting. See ya.